It really changes the intervention, right? If you're trying to help somebody with appetitive control around food and you assume that they have body dysmorphia or that they don't like the way they look or something like that, then you're not really appreciating the way that the food itself is driving the consumptive behavior for individuals for whom food is their drug of choice, which gets into the whole idea of drug of choice, that there's enormous inter-individual variability in terms of what stimulates your reward pathway versus what stimulates mine. Now, in general, intoxicants are reinforcing for most of us, like cocaine or stimulants are reinforcing for most people who take them. Not everybody, but most people. Nonetheless, people tend to have their drug of choice, that thing that once they start, it's very difficult to stop. And as you know, mine happens to be socially sanctioned pornography for women, which is the romance novel.
Hello, my geeslings. This is Mother Goose Robinson Earhart here with the introduction to Robinson's podcast, number 117. And this episode is with the lovely Dr. Anna Lembke, who it was such a joy to speak with. And Anna did her undergraduate work in the Humanities at Yale and her medical training here at Stanford, where she is currently professor and medical director of addiction medicine at the Stanford University School of Medicine, and she is also program director of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Fellowship and chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. And as I say at the end of our conversation, while so many of the episodes of this show are quite abstract and others technical as well, it is very nice to occasionally have episodes that are much more down to earth, which is just where this one lands. So Anna and I talk about her latest New York Times bestselling book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, which is all about the epidemic of addiction in the United States, though it extends, of course, albeit to a lesser extent to other countries. But more particularly, we talk about the neuroscience of addiction. So just what happens in the brain when someone develops an addiction, what current social and cultural conditions are contributing to increased rates of addiction, and how all of these factors and addiction itself ought to be combated. And this episode was not just insightful for me about the state of the country and other people's addictions, but also my own many addictions to food, work, exercise. I've got a bunch, but I'm sure that we all do. So Anna is also the author of Drug Dealer MD, How Doctors Were Duped, Patients Got Hooked, and Why It's So Hard to Stop, which sounded the alarm on and covers various dimensions of the opioid crisis. And of course, there are links to both of these books in the description. So let's see what else I should say. There's the Discord, which you can find through my website at robinsonearhart.com. And then you should also leave comments and reviews. And the point of that Discord, or at least one point, other than chatting with all those geeslings, is if you want to leave feedback or tell me guests you'd like to see on the show, I always like to take that into consideration. And now, I think without any further ado, I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it with Anna. Are you already working on the next book?
Such a good question. So I am thinking deeply about writing something, but I have a lot of trepidation about it because it's about spirituality and it's just so hard.
Got it. Yeah, hard to do as an academic because you're worried about whether you'll still be taken seriously. Is that
a little bit? But that I think just hard to do. It's so amorphous and tangible. There's been so much written. What I always doubt myself. What really do I have to contribute? Nothing is what the answer comes back as. But then I thought that about Dopamine Nation, and it seems like it resonated and helped people. So then try to quiet the doubting voices and move forward. Also, it's great occupational therapy for me.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, maybe that will figure into how we get started. But in 2016, you published the book Drug Dealer MD on the opioid epidemic, which I don't have to tell you, and which was part of the
It's
first.
good to remind me. I'm getting older, so I appreciate that.
Sure, but it was part of the first wave of calling the attention of the medical community and the world at large to the crisis. And since today we're going to focus more on addiction in general, which is the subject of the most recent book, Dopamine Nation, I couldn't help but wonder when I saw that you did your undergraduate degree in the humanities at Yale, how it was first that you ended up in psychiatry, and second, why addiction happened to become the major focus of your career, both as a practitioner and then now your side gig as a public facing individual.
Yeah, so great questions. So actually the distance between being an undergraduate major in humanities and being a psychiatrist is not that far. I would say if there's one medical specialty that dives deeply into the humanities, it is psychiatry, which is why it really, at the end of the day, called to me. But I was resistant to that. Initially, I went into pathology, where I thought I would discover sort of things that are black and white, no doubt about it. You look at a cell, it's either cancerous or it's not, and discovered really quickly that that's not the case, that there's really nothing that's black and white, and that even our so-called, wet science or bench kinds of cellular analyses are filled with questions and ambiguity and problems with the frame of reference. So, and I'll just add to that, I have a very close relative who actually had a manic psychotic break while I was a medical student at Stanford. She was admitted to the psychiatric ward. And so my whole life is sort of like shying away from the thing that I should do and then realizing it and coming back to it later. So originally, it really resisted psychiatry because it felt too close to home. I felt like I wouldn't be able to tolerate it. So almost went in the opposite direction of sort of like a avoidant coping mechanism. Thought I'm going to do pathology, cut and dry. I'm going to be, a teacher of science, and then discovered it was not for me and also quite worrying for me. So went back to psychiatry. And the same thing with addiction. So I have alcoholism in my family. My father was a surgeon and also a high-functioning alcoholic. When I started my clinic here at Stanford, I said, I'll see anybody, but just nobody with addiction. And then the intake people came back to me and said, well, Dr. Lembke, there really isn't anybody like that. So good luck. There was also a patient that I had that I was seeing for psychotherapy. And she and I talked at great length about every conversation she'd ever had with her mother, but I never once asked her about drugs and alcohol. And then one day out of the blue, I got a call from her brother who said she's been in a rollover car accident. I said, oh my goodness, that's terrible. What happened? And he said, well, she's been using again. Using what? Like I literally didn't even understand the form of the sentence. And he said, she's been using heroin. Isn't that what you've been treating her for? And, it was like this moment of terrible shame where I realized, wow, I'm actually a bad psychiatrist. Like I have hurt this person because of my ignorance. So that was really a transformative moment where I thought, I need to learn about addiction and I need to figure out how to help people. And what I discovered is that when I asked the questions, patients were very eager to talk about it. So we have this idea that patients won't tell us the truth about their substance use problems and other addictions, but in fact, they're very eager to talk about it in a safe place if you create that space for them. So that's essentially the story.
Okay, well, a couple of things. First, I'm wondering if the connection, you said the humanities are somewhat close actually to psychiatry. And I'm wondering if it is because, just to take literature, for example, the propensity of great fiction writers to dive into characters and psychology. Is that what you were getting at?
Well, absolutely. You've tapped into really what is the unit of study in psychiatry and psychotherapy, it is the narrative, right? The way that we relate lived experiences, the way that we construct causality based on narrative. I have spent my entire professional career listening to patient stories, one patient at a time. So that's my unit of study. My unit of study is one human being at a time. And my vehicle for understanding them is the stories they tell, what they say it, how that narrative changes through time. So yes, you're absolutely right. It's all about stories.
It's funny, I think I could have. I mean, I was talking to my mom as I was reading this book, and I guess I didn't mention before we started, my mom's a psychiatrist, and I was telling her that as I was reading Dopamine Nation, it was clear to me that you had a penchant for fiction, and then of course I saw that you have an addiction to romance novels. But what I meant is the way that you write about your patients. I mean, you flesh them out like an author does their characters. So like Jacob, who I will probably never forget, with his addiction to masturbation machines, which was quite fascinating to read about. But maybe we should dive into some of the material then in the book. And I thought that a great place to start. You write in the beginning that scientists rely on dopamine as a kind of universal currency for measuring the addictive potential of any experience. And the more dopamine in the brain's reward pathway, the more addictive the experience. So what I was thinking is that at the outset, hopefully this isn't too pedantic or boring for you. We just go over some of the vocabulary so we have our basics in mind before we get to the specifics. So I was going to ask what precisely is dopamine, and what is the brain's reward pathway, and how dopamine functions in the same?
Great questions. Great to lay the foundation. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and neurotransmitters are the chemicals that bridge the gap between neurons. That gap is called the synapse. Neurons are the long, spindly cells in our brains that conduct the electrical circuits that make us, think and feel and all of that good stuff. But neurons don't touch end to end. There's a gap between them called the synapse that allows for fine-tuning of those electrical circuits. And that gap, or that synapse, is mediated by neurotransmitters. Dopamine is one of many neurotransmitters. Dopamine has multiple functions in the brain, but one very important function is that it mediates pleasure, reward, and motivation in a specific area of the brain called the reward pathway, which broadly speaking consists of the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, and the prefrontal cortex. Ventral tegmental area is rich in dopamine-releasing neurons that are then released in the nucleus accumbens. Those are these deeper structures in what we call the limbic brain, or the emotion processing brain, which in turn communicate with the prefrontal cortex, which is a gray matter area right behind our foreheads that's so important for delayed gratification, autobiographical narrative, appreciating future consequences. One way to think about these different parts of the reward pathway is to think about the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens as the accelerator in the car, prefrontal cortex as the brakes, and addiction as either a problem with the accelerator, as in a lead foot on the gas, a problem with the brakes, as in the brakes aren't working, or some combination of both.
This is just coming to me right now, but I recently spoke with the neuropsychologist Mark Solms about the foundations of consciousness, the neural foundations of consciousness, which he thinks come from, well, I'm not going to even try to say which area of the brain it is, but it has to do with the brainstem. But affect is really what's most important about consciousness. And one way we can tell whether lower organisms are conscious might be to see whether they enjoy things like cocaine. If they go back to cocaine over and over again, then we have some reason to think that they're feeling something.
Interesting hypothesis. I'm not going to venture into the whole consciousness thing. It's a quagmire. But what I can tell you is that in the work that we do, affect and emotion are very important. And there's a very famous psychoanalyst, now deceased, Michael Franz Bosch, who famously said, when you're in psychotherapy with a patient, follow the affect, which I love because it's like the contra to follow the money. It's follow the affect or follow the emotion. If in interacting with patients, there's an expression of emotion. That's an important thing. It's a little nugget of gold. Dig deeper there. You're headed in the right direction. I find that's especially true working with men in Silicon Valley who, just to grossly overgeneralize, tend to be very much living in their kind of rational brain and have more difficulty connecting to their emotions. So a lot of that is kind of like cracking through the ice of rationality and trying to tap into the emotions and get more connection to the emotions. And certainly a strong belief that there's a lot of truth and wisdom in our emotional lives, and that we shouldn't deny that.
Mm-hmm. And then I suppose this is one of the last, it's a big thing that I also have to ask, and that is what or how do you define addiction?
So addiction, broadly defined, is the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self and or others. There is no blood test or brain scan to diagnose addiction. It's based on what we call phenomenology, which is patterns of behaviors that repeat themselves reliably across individuals, cultures, continents, time periods. When we diagnose addiction clinically, we base it on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is kind of like the Bible of making diagnoses. But it's important to recognize that it's really just a bunch of people sitting around a table saying, wow, I think that this disorder manifests in this way based on the science, clinical observation. So the same thing is true for addiction. And the 11 criteria for diagnosing addiction, according to the DSM, can be condensed into what we call the 4 C's: control, compulsions, cravings, and consequences. So out of control use, compulsive use, meaning a lot of mental real estate occupied with the drug and a level of automaticity around it. Cravings, intense intrusive thoughts or feelings of wanting to use. And then finally, consequences, especially continued use despite consequences. So bad things happening as a result of this behavior, but nonetheless, the individual keeps using. Sometimes that's because the individual doesn't see the consequences, but even when the individual appreciates those consequences, cannot stop using.
Yeah, I was wondering if there was a clinical way of distinguishing between positive and negative addictions. And I suppose the most important of the 4 C's there would be consequences, because I imagine you can be compelled maybe to do something that is healthy, but if it doesn't have negative consequences, then we might not want to think of it as an addiction, that at least one that needs treatment.
It's a great question. When I use the word addiction, I am by definition talking about pathophysia. When I use the word addiction, I'm by definition talking about a mental health disorder. And if I'm not talking about a mental health disorder, that is something that has crossed the threshold into being harmful and consequential in a negative way, then I usually don't use that word. I know, in everyday speech, people will kind of use it casually. Oh, I'm addicted to X, Y, or Z. But in general, when I use that word, it means that it meets some threshold criteria for being a psychiatric disorder. But it can be very difficult to distinguish sort of a healthy passion or an intensity around a behavior and something that's maladaptive. For example, workaholism, right? We have a culture that strongly encourages and reinforces compulsive working. And we don't call that an addiction because our culture celebrates it. But really, it's meeting many of the same types of criteria, which is why I think addiction is actually so interesting to study, because all mental health disorders are biopsychosocial diseases. There's a biological component, psychological component, and a social or contextual component. But addiction more so than others, I think, because we're constantly redefining what's a legal drug, what's an illegal drug, right? What is adaptive use, what's maladaptive use.
Yeah, it's also interesting. I think we'll get into it later, but this social dimension is, for you, a very important element that needs to be considered when you're undergoing treatment. It's very important for treatment, for recovery, but can also promote relapse. And I guess actually maybe this is where we should start, in the sense that the social element also is a risk factor for addiction. And I'm sure you talk about this much more in Drug Dealer MD, but accessibility probably has to be one of the biggest risk factors of them all for addiction.
Yeah, in fact, that is sort of the central message of Dopamine Nation, right? This idea that in the modern world, we've all become vulnerable to the problem of addiction because we have so much more access than ever before in human history to highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors. And even seemingly healthy behaviors like reading, in my case, or playing games or exercise, have become drugified in the modern world, such that even those have become potentially addictive. And that's essentially the premise of Dopamine Nation. It seems self-evident that if you have increased access to a drug, you are more likely to get addicted to that drug. But believe it or not, it's a risk factor that people commonly forget. And it's one that I really want to bring, back to the discussion and raise awareness around, because it has a direct impact on our lives today because we are so saturated with these kind of dopamine releasing substances and behaviors.
And then, but there are other factors as well, right? So you write about how leisure time and the rise in poverty have also contributed to addiction. How do you see that working?
Yeah, so there's lots of risk factors for addiction. It's long been known that poverty is a risk factor, unemployment is a risk factor, severe stress, multi-generational trauma. Those are all risk factors. Co-occurring mental illness is a risk factor for addiction. Growing up in a family where substance use or maladaptive addictive coping is modeled as a risk factor. Attachment problems with caregivers are risk factors. So there are lots and lots of risk factors. But the risk factors that I think have not garnered enough attention in the modern world are access, quantity, potency, and novelty. So what I'm really trying to emphasize is that our brains evolved over millions of years of evolution to approach pleasure and avoid pain reflexively. We do that without even thinking about it. It's what's kept us alive in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger. But our brains were not evolved for substances and behaviors that release a lot of dopamine all at once. And we are reeling to try to compensate to these highly reinforcing experiences. And as a result, we are all getting caught in this kind of hedonic treadmill or addiction vortex.
I probably have many addictions. Definitely workaholism is one of them. But the salient addiction, given I think you said access, quantity, novelty, and potency, is my food addiction. And that is, you talk a lot about maybe not food so much in Dopamine Nation, but how market forces contribute to addiction. And I think of like the snack industry, way more access to what I guess I refer to them as treats. The serving sizes are much bigger. The potency. I just actually had some ice cream bars from Japan, and the level of sugar was so much less than what we get here. And then the novelty, there's new things for me to try. You might not believe this is crazy, but I have had a different pint of ice cream every day for the past 2 years. It's like a hobby.
Yeah. I thought I saw something that you eat a pint of ice cream for breakfast. Is that right?
More dinner right now, and I've also gotten into ice cream novelties. Okay. So today is Heath Klondike bars. But,
okay, all right.
But yeah, I guess in this case, the market forces are helping my pastime. But
Yeah, so exactly right. Our food supply has become drugified with the addition of fat, salt, sugar, and flavorants. Also, our access to these highly potent food sources means that it's very difficult to maintain appetitive control because these do function like drugs in our brains. Once we start eating, it's very difficult to stop. We don't reach that normal level of satiety that we would if we were eating, if we had been hungry, had to work for our food, and then ate the equivalent of broccoli or black beans and rice. There is, for example, a movement now that's called mindfulness eating, with this idea that if we're just appropriately mindful about our consumption, we wouldn't have these obesity problems. And I'm all for mindfully eating, but for people whose drug of choice is food, that's not going to work because of the environment that we're living in and the way that food has become drugified. Also of interest, there's a movement now within the field of mental health to reclassify eating disorders as food addiction. So right now they're classified under their own separate category of eating disorder, but there's a strong movement to really think about food as drugified, to acknowledge that we don't have appetitive control in the current ecosystem, and to think about eating disorders as aberrant eating or disordered eating as a result of the drugified food supply. And I'm working with colleagues around the world to try to do that. Why do I think that's important? Because it really changes the intervention, right? If you're trying to help somebody with appetitive control around food and you assume that they have body dysmorphia or that they don't like the way they look or something like that, that you're not really appreciating the way that the food itself is driving the consumptive behavior for individuals for whom food is their drug of choice, which gets into the whole idea of drug of choice, that there's enormous inter-individual variability in terms of what stimulates your reward pathway versus what stimulates mine. Now, in general, intoxicants are reinforcing for most of us, like cocaine or stimulants, are reinforcing for most people who take them. Not everybody, but most people. Nonetheless, people tend to have their drug of choice, that thing that once they start, it's very difficult to stop. And as you know, mine happens to be socially sanctioned pornography for women, which is the romance novel.
Yeah, that was what I was going to get into next. Or maybe you don't want to talk about that, but
that's fine.
I thought that we ought to go over maybe one case study or so, just because I think the going through like one peculiar maybe addiction better exposes the pathology than talking about it in a more abstract way. We might connect it to the 4 C's that you brought up earlier.
Yeah, sounds good. Do you want me to talk about my own?
Sure.
Okay. So, as I said, addiction runs in my family, but my early experience with drugs and alcohol, my early experiences were neutral or negative, meaning that I never found alcohol to be a euphoriant or a relaxant. It just made me tired and gave me a headache. Caffeine doesn't wake me up. So in general, I just sort of assumed that the addiction gene had skipped me and that I just didn't have that problem. But in my early 40s, when things in my life were going really well, so it wasn't like, I was looking for some sort of magical escape. A friend of mine recommended the Twilight Saga, which is a teenage vampire romance series of novels, which I just sort of read because I've always been a reader, and that's how I kind of, reward myself or recreate. And there was something about that was incredibly transportative for me and really reinforcing. So I read all the books, and I read all the books again and again. And I found that by the 4th read through of all of the books, they were enjoyable, but not as enjoyable as the first time around. So I went looking for more romance novels. And to my surprise, for whatever reason, I hadn't discovered them as a younger woman. I discovered a whole universe of romance novels. Like there were lots more vampire romance novels. And then I moved on to werewolves and necromancers and soothsayers and crystal workers and, you name it.
I'm particularly curious about those necromancer.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And then, and this is where technology interfaces with this problem, my friend Susan said, oh, you should get a Kindle. And that way you can just download them. You don't have to go to the library. So I did, and I got an e-reader. And that's when things really got problematic, because as soon as I finished one book, I could get another. I sort of accelerated to chain reading. There was this anonymous element where nobody could see what I was reading, which allowed me to kind of hide the behavior. I found I was spending more and more time reading. And slowly and insidiously, what happened was that other things that I prioritized and valued in my life and enjoyed, I stopped prioritizing, I stopped valuing, and importantly, I stopped enjoying. And my focus became very narrowed on this one activity. I put a lot more energy into it, was spending a lot more time doing it, to the point where I was staying up very late at night reading, tired the next day, had difficulty focusing, was taking it on vacation, hiding in a room, not socializing. I was reading. And then at one point was even taking romance novels to work and reading in those 10 minutes between patients, which was probably like the nadir for me. It's okay. You can laugh. It's all good.
We've all had our addiction.
Yeah,
nadirs.
we've all had our things, right? But again, I'm a psychiatrist. I treat addiction, and I didn't really see it as it was unfolding. And what I especially didn't see was the way that my pleasure or joy in other things became less, that my other experiences were impoverished. I had this narrowing of my focus. I had a kind of over-reliance on this one behavior as my great escape. And then ultimately developed tolerance, meaning that I needed more potent forms. So, no longer was it teenage vampire romance novels. I was reading frank pornography, pornography not consistent with my values, stuff that I was basically be ashamed for other people to know I was reading. And then my sort of moment of awakening and awareness, which is so key with any addiction, is when I had to do a role play with a psychiatry resident where I was the patient and we were practicing something called motivational interviewing. He said, is there a behavior you want to change? And I said, let me see. And I thought, well, I guess I want to change my late night reading habit. I did not go into the details of what that was. This is a young man. That would have been very embarrassing. I wouldn't have even been willing to say it to anybody at that point. And then, he said to me, well, is there one thing that you feel like you could change in your life to change that habit? And I thought, well, I could get rid of my Kindle. I think that would slow it down. And the next day, this was all just like a role play. I wasn't really thinking about doing this. But the next day, I couldn't unsee it, right? So having said it aloud to another human, I was like, you know what? I really do want to change that behavior. And I think I really will try to do that. And I think I will get rid of my Kindle. And then from there was sort of this process of trying to get into recovery, which turned out to be a heck of a lot harder than I thought it would be.
Can you explicitly connect what you just told me to those 4 C's? Because I feel like that's something that people should, even if they're not diagnosticians, maybe they should just be more aware of that.
Yeah. So the control piece is using more than intended, or for longer time periods. So basically, I had unlearned how to go to sleep without reading romance novels, and also a behavior associated with that, which I will leave to your imagination. And what happened was that every single night I would say, I would wake up in the morning and I would say, I'm not going to do that tonight. And then come the nighttime, I would read much longer than I planned to. I would say, I'm going to stop at the end of this chapter. Really, I'm going to stop at the end of this chapter. I would get to the end of the chapter and I would read another chapter. So that's a good example of out of control use. Compulsive use is just like a lot of mental real estate thinking about it. And we often rationalize this by saying, I'm really into, so at one point I was reading 50 Shades of Grey, and I kept rationalizing that this was like a modern day retelling of Pride and Prejudice. So there were ways that I was trying to compare what's really just pornography to, literature. And people do this all the time with things like alcohol. Oh, I'm learning, these craft beers, or I'm really into wine and into the bouquet, or I'm really into ice cream flavors and I've got all these different flavors that I like. And again, that also may be true and not sign of an addiction, but it can be a way that we sort of use up a lot of our brain time sort of focused on that. The compulsive piece is, related to all this, but it comes up, sort of the craving piece comes up mainly when people try to stop. And so what I did with the romance novels was I committed to not reading or doing the related behavior for 4 weeks, which is this kind of dopamine fasting intervention. And I'll never forget that first 10 to 14 days. I would come to the end of my day, do all the chores for the family, this and that. And then the time would come when I would normally get my reward or my escape, or, our brains are kind of like little alarm clocks when it comes to dopamine. That was my time. And I had intense cravings, like very overwhelming desire to want to use that behavior. And, I was trying not to. But the extent to which it sort of grips all of us, all of ourselves, mind and bodies, is really impressive. And then the consequences part, especially continued use despite consequences, the very common consequence that people often don't see without help is the ways in which this continued pursuit of this pleasure actually leads to more suffering for us in the form of irritability, anxiety, depression, insomnia. And I was experiencing that, right? I have a great family, and yet I was getting less joy from my family life. It was consequential in that I was not getting enough sleep, right? And I really care about my patients, and yet I would be bleary-eyed at work. So, fortunately in my case, those were pretty mild consequences. So I would say it was a very soft addiction. But of course, in my clinical work, people die from this problem. This is life-threatening, in some instances.
Well, the consequences and pain in general is something we'll get to in a moment, because it's key to the entire framework of the book. But first, I wanted to go back to when you began answering my question about the vampire romance novels, and you said things were going well at the time and you weren't looking for an escape. But I'm curious whether now you think that was just how you felt consciously at the time, but in retrospect you realized that there were underlying problems or stressors in your life that contributed to the addiction that you weren't aware of. I'm not trying to turn this into your own therapy session.
No, that's a really fair question. I guess what I would say is a little of both. So on one very real level, I had and have a very privileged life. And I'm very fortunate in my marriage. I'm very fortunate with my children. I'm very fortunate in my work. There really is no significant stress or trauma. And I think that's an important point to make. And so I make it, loudly and often, because many times patients want to look for the why behind the addictive behavior, when the addictive behavior is really its own explanation. It doesn't really need a why. Now, having said that, it is also very true that stress is a contributing factor. Trauma is a contributing factor. When people are in, difficult life circumstances, it's natural that they would turn to a substance or behavior to try to escape. So I'm not trying to minimize the causality there. I just want to emphasize that there doesn't need to be a reason. And even if there is a reason, if we spend too long there, we can sort of get lost. A lot of what we talk about in addiction treatment is actions before feelings. So to do the behavioral change before you feel like doing it, because if you wait till you feel like doing it, or if you wait till things are better in your life, or wait till you're not depressed, or wait till you've resolved this relationship, the actions will never come. But certainly in retrospect, just to get back to really what your question was, yes, I could identify some specific things in my life, primarily around the fact that my life was entering a transition phase where I was going to have to give up something I really liked, which was being a mother to, smaller children. And my kids were entering adolescence, and I was going through a kind of a grief reaction around not having more children and having to deal with teenagers, which was much more challenging for me than, raising young children. So kind of a mourning around that life change.
Yeah, well, the reason that I ask, and I think you brought it up and got to it, is that, like you mentioned, sometimes there are causes of an addiction, but in other cases, there doesn't need to be a reason, because as with the euphoriants you described earlier, like cocaine or meth, I mean, availability in some cases can be sufficient for the addiction. You can have no underlying problems, but if I had no underlying problems, if you started giving me injecting heroin every day, I would just become addicted. So looking for the why isn't always going to be a useful exercise.
That's right. I agree with you.
Okay, good, great. And then moving on, one of the topics in Dopamine Nation that I found most fascinating was the degree of pain that people report and how it varies from country to country. So maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the research behind this sort of surprising phenomenon.
Yeah, so I'm not remembering now the exact statistics that I quoted in the book, but broadly, what is a very interesting phenomenon is when you look at either psychological or physical pain surveys, where you give a bunch of questionnaires worded in sensitive ways to account for differences in values or subcultures, etc. What you find is that people living in the United States are among the least happy people in the world, the most depressed and anxious people in the world, and the people experiencing the most physical pain in the world. And this is a surprise, right? Because we have more access to mental health care treatment than anywhere in the world. We consume some 80% of the world's hydrocodone, a highly potent opioid, even though we constitute 5% of the world's population. Now, we could go down that road about how opioid essentially, supports the argument in Dopamine Nation that repeated use of a highly reinforcing substance or behavior causes more pain, because that's what opioids do if taken habitually over time for pain. But the larger, message here is that we're clearly getting something horribly wrong about how to have a flourishing existence in the modern world, as well as how to treat psychological and mental suffering. Because there is a dominant mode in psychiatry and psychology today that says if you are feeling any kind of pain, you should immediately make yourself even more comfortable and remove pain from your life, make yourself more comfortable. And yet our best attempts to do that are not leading where we want to go. So, for example, even just global happiness surveys from prior to the year 2000, what we saw was that as countries got wealthier, this is prior to 2000, as countries got wealthier around the world, people seemed to get happier. Gee, that makes a lot of sense, right? Nobody wants to live in poverty. But for about the last 20 years, it's been some kind of tipping point, and the wealthier the country, the less happy people are, the more anxious, the more depressed, and the more in physical pain.
Well, I just pulled up that statistic because it's very interesting. It's worth reading that. Okay. 34% of Americans said they felt pain often or very often, compared to 19% of people living in China, 18% of people living in Japan, 13% of people living in Switzerland, and 11% of people living in South Africa. So the question is, why, in a time of unprecedented wealth, freedom, technological progress, and medical advancement, do we appear to be unhappier and in more pain than ever? Which you pointed to, but I think that is just a very fascinating study and statistic.
Yeah, and it really begs the question, right? Like, what is going on? And so the hypothesis is that it is the excess of highly reinforcing substances and behaviors that we were not evolved for that's actually leading to a kind of chronic dopamine deficit state.
Right. I think this is an interesting term and worth bringing in, but you talk in the book about, briefly, something called opioid-induced hyperalgesia, and maybe
Hyperalgesia, yeah.
algesia. Okay,
Yeah.
and I have so many aches, and I wonder if it's connected to algesia, but more generally just dopamine induced because I'm not. I mean, I don't take opioids, so. But I think that's the general hypothesis.
Right. So the idea in giving opioids liberally for pain, which started at the end of the 1990s in response to a huge promotional campaign by Purdue and others, was to alleviate the rising rates of pain in an aging population or people living with chronic pain conditions. But instead, what happened is that people seemed to, over time, experience more and more pain. And now we see many otherwise healthy young people coming in with pain all over their bodies for no identifiable reason. And so again, it's hard to know exactly what is going on, but the hypothesis is that it's actually the ways in which we are insulated from pain, detached from our bodies, not moving our bodies in the way that they were meant to be moved, not connecting brain and body, so that we've got this busy brain trying to figure out what the body is doing. The body is sitting there all day, not doing anything. And then a brain that gets really confused by that and reads all kinds of sensory signals as pain signals.
Mm-hmm. And then there's also this, I mean, you have these diagrams in your book with like pain gremlins. I don't know, maybe I think they're gremlins, not goblins, but there's it's called a seesaw, right? I was going to call it a teeter-totter,
Yeah,
but
no, that's good. Either one. Yep.
I think it's called a seesaw. But there's a mechanism in our brain that contributes toward this tilt toward the pain side of the seesaw after we have a flood of dopamine. And maybe, I mean, we started off with a little bit of neuroscience, but what is the mechanism that contributes to this tottering of the seesaw?
Right. So this is called the opponent process theory, and it's based on a lot of information and science in the past 50 to 75 years showing that pain and pleasure are co-located in the brain. So the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like opposite sides of this balance. So imagine that when the balance is at rest, it's level with the ground. That represents our pleasure, pain, reward system when it's at rest, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis. When we experience pleasure, it tips one way. When we experience pain, it tips the opposite. And there are certain rules governing the balance. And the first is that the balance wants to stay level, and our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance with any deviation from neutrality. And the way that our brains do that is first by tilting an equal and opposite amount to whatever the initial stimulus is. So when we use an intoxicant, releases dopamine in the reward pathway, the balance tilts to the side of pleasure, but then these gremlins, which represent neuroadaptation, hop on the pain side to bring it level again. They like it there, so they stay on until it's tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's the come down, the after effect, that moment of wanting to read one more chapter in my romance novel. But if I wait long enough, and if I'm not yet addicted, gremlins hop off and homeostasis is restored. But the second rule of the balance is that with repeated exposure to the same or similar highly reinforcing stimulus, that initial deviation to pleasure gets weaker and shorter, and that after effect to pain gets stronger and longer until essentially those gremlins multiply. Now they fill up this whole room. They're camped out on the pain side of the balance. And now we're in a chronic dopamine deficit state, which essentially just means we've changed our hedonic or joy set point. Now we need to do that behavior, not to feel good and get high, but just level the balance. And when we're not using, we're walking around with the balance tilted to the side of pain. And to me, that's a really helpful metaphor for understanding what happens in the brain as we get addicted, why people with severe addiction will relapse, even after they can see that their lives are so much better when they're not using. It's because those gremlins don't get off right away, right? So if we've been using that substance or behavior for weeks to months to years, it may take weeks to months to years for the brain to really fully heal. And in some cases, the plasticity to do so may be lost, which means that now you've got kind of a permanent dopamine deficit state. So it's a way to sort of understand that whole process and how it gets broken by a world in which dopamine is released so much and so quickly in response to these manufactured kind of stimulants of all sorts that our brain, really can get permanently damaged from the experience.
I find this story so compelling, just also because it meshes with my own experience. But to recapitulate, to make sure that I'm totally on the same page, and my listeners are as well. So the neuroadaptation, or the process of neuroadaptation described by the opponent process theory that is figuratively embodied by your pain gremlins, it results in when the seesaw goes way up because you're very happy with your flood of dopamine. After that, the pain gremlins jump on, it goes all the way down, and they pile on until eventually you're in this perpetually negative state. And then when you don't have your drug of choice, which at this point is just getting you to a state of equilibrium, that's when you feel at your worst because there's nothing to counterbalance the pain gremlin. So for me, when I was like at my worst binge eating, if I would stop doing that, that's when I would feel at my absolute worst. And it's because nothing is fighting off those pain gremlins.
Exactly. You said it beautifully. And so when people get into recovery, what I explained to them is now you're going to be taking that weight off the pleasure side, but those gremlins that you've accumulated on the pain side, they're going to slam you down to the side of pain. You're going to experience the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance or behavior, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. And that typically goes on for 10 to 14 days in terms of the acute withdrawal before it starts to abate, before the gremlins get the memo, oh, wait a minute, we're not getting this exogenous source of dopamine, time to hop off the balance and for homeostasis or healthy dopamine levels to be restored.
I'm right now, it's occurring to me that you had a patient who was, I think, a high schooler and addicted to cannabis, and you said to her that you wanted her to stop smoking for a month because that was the minimal sort of safe duration to reset the seesaw. I'm wondering if you ever encounter patients who have a particularly intractable addiction where their brain just doesn't want to go back to normal. And if that is the case, how you deal with that. Perhaps this is where some of the pharmaceuticals enter.
Yeah, so we do see that all the time, right? Because the people who have that level of addiction will be the people who either come to us for help, or relative brings them in, or they have severe consequence professionally or with the law, so that kind of mandates them coming in. And what we find is that even in those individuals, if they are able to abstain from their drug of choice for 4 weeks, the majority of them will start to feel substantially better. Of course, they're not going to be all the way healed and their addiction isn't cured because we think of it as a chronic relapsing and remitting disease. One way to imagine that is that these gremlins, once created, they may hop off, but they don't entirely disappear. They're waiting in the wings, eager to hop on again. And there's no build-up period, right? Now you don't have to multiply the gremlins. They already exist and they hop on. And we see that clinically. We see that also with imaging, when my colleagues looking at how recovery happens in the brain and noting that there are permanently damaged areas. So the way that we have to deal with that is often by higher level of care. So having people go to a residential treatment facility, for example, where they don't have access to their drug, can be a lifesaver, for many people. I mean, there's so many jokes and denigration of rehab, but I can tell you as an addiction treatment psychiatrist, I'm very grateful for residential treatment because some people just literally cannot stop on their own. We have medicines that we can use. The classic example is opioid agonist therapy, which is to say using an opioid like methadone or buprenorphine to treat an opioid addiction. And it seems very counterintuitive, but what we think, again, going back to this metaphor, is that sometimes even prolonged abstinence will not, in some people's brains, get those gremlins to hop off, which means that, people are constantly using up all their energy managing cravings. And so they really can't move forward in their lives. But if we give them a long-acting opioid like methadone or buprenorphine, it allows them to restore homeostasis so that they can engage in other aspects of their life and in their recovery. And there are other medicines that we use to help with that. There's also, very commonly spiritual pathways. So a lot of people in recovery get there, especially the most severely addicted, through spiritual pathways, often through the 12 steps, this notion of higher power. Of course, we don't know exactly how that works, but we know phenomenologically that it can be very helpful, maybe by activating other parts of the brain that allow people to modulate these reward circuits. Or maybe it's some other type of intervention. Who knows?
Well, just to put a bow on this aspect of our conversation, I am wondering then, so you brought up at the beginning this biopsychosocial model of addiction. So obviously there are going to be social factors that contribute to relapse, but psychologically, biologically, I'm guessing that the way that we can understand the tendency to relapse is through this picture of the seesaw. The withdrawal symptoms just become so unbearable to the addict that in order to get back to equilibrium, they have to return to their substance.
Yeah, I think there are sort of three ways to think about the biological mechanisms. One of them is the one you identified, the way that exposure itself to a highly reinforcing drug or behavior changes our brain over time. That gets us caught on this hedonic treadmill or addiction vortex. The other way is the inborn or innate inherited vulnerability to addiction. So we don't all come into this world with equal amounts of vulnerability. There are some people who really are much more vulnerable to the problem of appetitive control than others. And those individuals will struggle with addictions to all kinds of things. They will get into recovery from one addiction only to find that it transitions to another addiction. Those are the most severely addicted among us, for whom this modern ecosystem is incredibly challenging. I talk about them as modern day prophets for the rest of us, because as a matter of survival, people with recovery from severe addictions have had to figure out how to navigate this world. I also hypothesize that, in whatever thousands, millions of years ago, even probably just hundreds of years ago, people with the inherited addiction vulnerability were probably the most valuable members of a tribe, because they were willing to work harder, walk further, to get, find the berry bush or get water or find a mate. So what was once very advantageous and therefore conserved through evolution is now a bit of a liability. But if you can channel it in the right way, people in recovery from severe addictions turn out to be some of the most amazing people you will ever meet. So it can still be a positive, and not necessarily a negative. And then the third way is some sort of, other co-occurring factor that's not like an addiction vulnerability, but another co-occurring factor that contributes to addiction or vulnerability. And that's things like co-occurring mental illness. So we know that people with co-occurring anxiety, bipolar disorder, depression, schizophrenia, they have rates of addiction that are much higher than the general population. And that's probably because they're turning to these behaviors as a way to manage their psychiatric symptoms. Some of them will realize quickly that it doesn't work. The more you use a substance or behavior in an addictive way, the worse the outcome of your mental illness. But nonetheless, it's a doorway that gets people into using the substance, which for some people then leads to a co-occurring addiction.
Well, I think that at this point, we've talked a lot about the sort of negative dimensions of addiction and maybe you might call them the diagnostic dimensions. But at this point, we should probably turn toward the more positive things like recovery. And there are lots of tools in the toolkit, but for a start, how does understanding this balance between pain and pleasure provide us with at least a schema of sorts, regardless of just what the addiction is, for tackling that addiction?
Yeah, I think it provides a schema in the sense that it explains what's going on in the brain and it suggests the intervention, which is to say that we need to abstain from our drug or behavior of choice long enough for those neuroadaptation gremlins to hop off the pain side of the balance and for homeostasis to be restored. So that really is the beginning, the entry point, both to being able to enjoy other things again beyond our addiction, as well as to be able to have insight. Because one thing that happens in the brain as we're chasing dopamine is we lose the ability to see true cause and effect. And we really don't see it. I don't like the word rationalization because it implies that we're trying to convince ourselves of something, when in fact, there's no convincing necessary because we really don't see that this substance or this behavior is causing ourselves and or other people harm until we stop for long enough to restore a level balance, kind of get our prefrontal cortex talking to our nucleus accumbens in a way that allows us to sort of see what the gremlins are doing and manage them. So I had a great, I love your cat. He's so much fun. I'm actually addicted to your cat. So I had a great reader of Dopamine Nation who wrote in and said that he found the pleasure pain balance metaphor in gremlins so helpful. He was trying to quit smoking, and whenever he would experience cravings for a cigarette, he would just imagine those gremlins hopping up and down on the pain side of the balance. He said, I know it's really silly, but I just think I'm going to beat you, gremlins. And so I think that kind of frame can be really helpful, especially in a culture that's telling us, pursue pleasure, don't stress yourself out, rest, eat a cupcake. Because what we didn't talk about yet, but which is equally important, is this idea of hormesis, which is to say that intentionally pressing on the pain side of the balance with things like exercise, ice cold water immersion, prayer, meditation, anything that requires effortful investment of, some physical or mental endurance, will actually get those gremlins to switch over on the pleasure side, and we will reset our reward pathways by paying for it. Paying for our dopamine up front. So all of this informs a slightly different intervention to what ails us than if we didn't have this conceptualization of how we process pleasure and pain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with regard to hormesis, I was amazed that one of these patients that you've treated, I think he was, maybe it was alcohol and cocaine or just cocaine, but one of the tools that he used for overcoming his addiction was these cold water baths, which I know you were on Rogan. Rogan is a huge fan of those baths. But what amazes me about that is how much I absolutely hate them and could not ever imagine loving them. Our brains are all just so different.
Yes, you and me both. I actually cannot stand cold water. I have tried. And people will say, at first it shocks you, but then the longer you're in it, it starts to feel good. And then afterwards, you get this kind of euphoric high. That is not what happens to me, which again, I think powerfully speaks to the inter-individual variability, how complex our brains are, how there are these basic mechanisms that are similar, but they're slightly tweaked, and slightly different between us, which, by the way, is probably also an evolutionary mechanism that's advantageous, right? If you had a tribe where everybody was going for the exact same berry bush, that would not be that good an idea. But if you had some people who really like berries and other people who like bison and other people who are looking for, other people, that's better. That sort of ensures that as a collective, you will get all the things that you need.
Well, okay, so we have hormesis. There is another tool for dealing with addiction it's really a family of tools, probably in the same way that hormesis is, but it's called self-binding, and I hadn't heard that terminology before. I think we're all probably intuitively familiar with the idea, but what is self-binding?
So self-binding is a way to create both literal and metacognitive barriers between ourselves and our drug of choice so that we can press the pause button between desire and consumption. I use the classic myth of Odysseus, who was traveling through the channel where, these sort of mermaid-like creatures would sing and, cause the the sailors to shipwreck and die. And so Odysseus said to his crew, I want you to put beeswax in your ears so that you don't hear it, so we can go through the passageway. And he said, for myself, I want you to bind me to this mast, and if I try to break free, bind me tighter, because he wanted to hear it. And there's an interesting sort of epilogue to that myth that I didn't know before sort of researching it more closely, which is the reason that Odysseus wanted to hear the sirens was so that he could tell the story about it later, because the true conquering of any behavior is being able to then narrate that experience as a kind of way to understand.
That's a deep therapeutic truth there.
We're coming full circle to our narrative thing. But anyway, what it basically says is that, if we rely on willpower alone, none of us will be successful in this endeavor, especially living in a world that is completely saturated with dopamine releasing substances and behaviors. We must self-bind. We must create these barriers. And there are a million ways to do it. Not carrying our smartphone around with us, deleting apps, making it go grayscale so it's less potent, not having alcohol or potato chips or ice cream in the house, getting rid of your Kindle so that you can't easily download free, pornography from Amazon. All of these things are ways to respect that willpower is not an unlimited resource, and that we're living in this incredibly titillating environment. In some ways, the pinnacle of capitalism and the capitalist system is to turn us all into addicts. And if we don't push against that intentionally and in advance, we will none of us make it.
Well, I pulled up another quote from the book. This time, not yours, but you quoted Immanuel Kant's Metaphysics of Morals. And he wrote, when we realize that we are capable of this inner legislation, the natural man feels himself compelled to reverence for the moral man in his own person. And this related to self-binding. And I thought it was a very nice point that self-binding can also promote self-esteem, which I imagine really tremendously furthers its capacity for supporting abstinence and aiding in recovery. Because one dimension of addiction that we haven't talked about, but that goes hand in hand with some of those 4 C's, is the sense of helplessness that an addict has. Because I know that I certainly felt that. I mean, that's definitive of binge eating. I mean, not being able to control yourself, and by successfully self-binding yourself, even though, self-binding doesn't really have a positive connotation. It doesn't sound like a good thing.
Except for Kant can turn it into that.
Yeah. But by successfully doing that and mastering yourself, it definitely improves your self-esteem, which is helpful for your own efficacy as an agent in overcoming the addiction.
Yeah, that's super insightful for you, because this comes up that's super insightful of you, because this comes up all the time in clinical care, where patients in recovery will say, I feel like I'm a grown-up for the first time. I feel like I can, actually express my thoughts and feelings, and I don't have to be ashamed of them. There's so much shame, in addiction, but this kind of feeling like, like you're, you can rely on yourself and be confident in yourself as an agent in the world. And that all comes with recovery in a really powerful and meaningful way.
Mm-hmm. And one other binding technique, I think the drug that you mentioned earlier was buprenorphine. Is that how it's pronounced?
Buprenorphine, yeah, it's an opioid.
Buprenorphine.
Yeah, these are all very hard to say.
Yes. So there are, maybe it's not self-binding, but it is a bind. You might consider it a binding technique. But there are some other drugs that you talk about in the book. I think disulfiram is maybe one of them, and then naltrexone, I think, was the other. And I'm wondering if any of these drugs, as I recall, maybe naltrexone was the one that might best fit this bill, if they are effective binding techniques for people who have addictions that are not to very specific substances like opioids or alcohol, whether they can be used for somebody who has a food addiction or a vampire novel addiction or something like that.
Yeah, great. So naltrexone is an opioid receptor blocker. Okay, and we make our own endogenous opioids. And when we take naltrexone, we essentially block those receptors. So naltrexone is FDA approved to treat opioid addiction, which makes sense, right? When you're blocking that opioid receptor and you take something like heroin or OxyContin, it can't bind to the receptor and it's inert. It doesn't work. Interestingly, it's also FDA approved to treat alcohol addiction because alcohol is partially mediated through our endogenous opioid system. So what happens when people now take naltrexone and they drink alcohol is that they will report that it's not as reinforcing for them. So instead of wanting to drink the whole 6-pack, they just want one beer and then they can kind of stop. So again, helping them with that appetitive control. Naltrexone has also been shown to help with cravings for alcohol. And the way that we speculate it works is that even when people get cravings for a drug, they get a little bit high. There's a little release of dopamine, followed by a little mini dopamine deficit state, which drives the cravings. If we block the receptor with naltrexone, that means that thinking about the drug doesn't give as much of that euphoric recall, so that even the little high we get from the trigger are reduced, which means that we also don't get into that craving load. And yes, there have been lots and lots of studies looking at naltrexone for other types of compulsive overconsumption, from gambling to sex to food addictions to probably many more, that I haven't named. It's a well-tolerated drug. There's a lot of inter-individual variability in terms of efficacy, even within the approved indications. But for people for whom it works, it tends to be helpful, if even very helpful. What I think is even more fascinating is that naltrexone is being used for some people with chronic pain. So not people who are addicted, but people who have chronic pain, because by binding that opioid receptor, what we're effectively doing is telling our system, hey, we don't have enough endogenous opioids. It's time for the opioid factories to make more. And by doing that, that can create a kind of a natural mechanism for pain relief.
Now, when I spoke with your colleague in psychiatry, David Spiegel, we went into a variety of therapeutic treatment modalities, mainly because we were comparing them with hypnotherapy, but we also compared them to pharmaceutical interventions. And I'm wondering how you see pharmaceutical interventions compared to therapeutic, or I think you'd probably want to call them therapeutic interventions for addiction, when you would want to use one, when you would want to use the other. And my first guess is, if part of therapy isn't just about overcoming this addiction, but also helping the person, you would want to be trying therapy first, because it may be going back to Kant again. You're trying to, one, further self-understanding and then self-esteem. But then at some point, that might just not be powerful enough if there are enough and sufficiently ferocious gremlins on the seesaw.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start by saying that I do probably have a bias or an intuition that something that's hard-earned is longer lasting behaviorally and neurologically. And psychotherapy and other psychosocial interventions take more time. It's a form of slow medicine. And so that doing it that way is preferred. That's probably my bias. But my intuition is that it's also more permanent, longer lasting. I want to emphasize, however, that every clinical day of the week, I prescribe medications. I use that tool all the time. And then in the real world, what we end up, giving patients is based more on what they're willing to do and what they can pay for or have access to based on their insurance, et cetera, than what we think is the idealized version of what they should and could do. So, for example, there are many people that I think would really benefit from psychotherapy. It's very hard to find an individual psychotherapist, and it's difficult to pay for that kind of treatment. So then we're kind of stuck with having to use pharmacologic interventions, maybe where it's not even the ideal. In the ideal world, every patient would have access to all of those different interventions, biological and also psychosocial, because I think at the end of the day, what works for one person isn't going to work for another. And we want to be able to have, to fine tune it and individualize it as well as combine. So we'll use, the best treatments are probably the ones that combine the pharmacologic with the psychosocial, especially for the most severely addicted.
Now, you have this bias towards slow medicine because what you said, or the way you put it, is what's harder earned is longer lasting. And I also definitely have that intuition. It makes sense to me. And maybe though you're agnostic on this topic, but I wonder how you feel about the rising popularity of and research into medically overseen psychedelic treatment for addictions, because I just have the sense, I mean, I hear about it so much that a lot of it is, maybe this is my bias. I think a lot of it just has to be totally overblown and a product of our tendency to just want a quick fix. And people have this dream now that a dose of mushrooms or 8 doses supervised by a therapist is going to cure all their problems.
I agree with you. And it is a fact that the media hype has far outstripped the evidence. The evidence is very preliminary. And if you look, in fact, at the evidence for treatment of mental health disorders, it's not robust. And especially not robust for psychedelics. So things like psilocybin in the treatment of depression. There's a New England Journal of Medicine study comparing psilocybin to Lexapro, which is an FDA-approved serotonin reuptake inhibitor, finding that they're pretty much comparable in terms of efficacy, which means that psilocybin is not a breakthrough medicine, right? It's not going to solve our mental health crisis. Furthermore, we know that these are potentially very dangerous drugs, and that people can have full-blown bad trips and end up, ending their lives under those circumstances. And the more access we have, the more we're seeing those types of very bad outcomes. Whereas I have never heard of that with, an SSRI. I mean, there's, some sense that it can contribute to suicidality, but not psychosis and, sudden violence. But even sort of phenomenologically, I have a real problem with the way that these medications are being proposed to work, which is that they're not being put forward by the scientific community as treatment by themselves. It's problematic in its own way, but they're actually being recommended as a way to facilitate psychotherapy. And the reason that really bothers me is because what we're saying to people is, you need a drug to have a human attachment. And part of the huge work that we do in addiction medicine is trying to educate people about how to have intimate human connections without using drugs. Because many, many patients and people in general don't know how to connect with other people unless they're under the influence. So I just think the whole framework is highly problematic. Also, when you look at sort of the spirituality scales, because what goes along with this is this idea that people can reach some kind of new spiritual awakening through this process. But if you actually look at the way they're measuring spirituality and the spirituality scales, it sounds a heck of a lot like getting high, right? Do you feel like, you're elevated and that you feel one with the universe? It's like, yeah, that's how people feel when they get high. I mean, so, what are we actually measuring there when we talk about spirituality? Plus, is it really changing behavior for the long term? Do people, they might feel more spiritually connected, but are they actually living more spiritual lives? So I think there's so much here. I'm all for, rational and slow and measured research. and media coverage that is tempered. But the problem is that by getting out there and just saying that this is, will give you a spiritual awakening, or it'll cure your depression or your PTSD, before you know it, you've got the TikTok video, and then you've got all kinds of people microdosing themselves. That's just so scary.
Yeah, I'm really glad that I asked you this, because I found all of that quite interesting, especially that comment you made toward the end about the way that they are measuring how spiritual people feel. Yeah, that is just what it's like to be high. And this is also totally anecdotal, but everybody I know that has gone to Peru for the ayahuasca journey or anything like that and comes back saying that they're totally transformed, they may say that they're totally transformed and they may keep that up for a few weeks, but it quickly goes right back to exactly what they were like beforehand, which goes back to, and again, this is obviously all conjecture, but it goes back to your initial hunch that what is harder earned lasts longer. Mm-hmm. But like you, and I think this is what I hear, I'm totally, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but I'm totally open to new forms of treatment that might include some of these drugs, but I'm also skeptical of the levels of efficacy I hear on these podcasts. It's also, you have to question the interest, because the people who are trumpeting the drugs are the people who were already taking them and so in love with them. I mean, not to say that there aren't researchers who have never taken them themselves and are much more sober about it, but I think that because of who it's coming from, it often needs to be taken with a grain of salt.
Oh, absolutely. I don't know of any other area of pharmacologic research where the people doing the research and profiting from the companies that may ultimately make and distribute these drugs are also people who regularly do them themselves or have done them. So I think there's a lot to be skeptical of.
Okay. And then maybe we're finishing up soon. One other thing that we haven't touched on yet, though maybe I alluded to it being in Dopamine Nation at the beginning of our conversation when we were talking about the social factors that contribute to addiction. There are social factors that can help treat addiction as well. So maybe you'd like to talk about those a bit.
Yeah, so there's lots of evidence that human connection and having meaningful relationships with other people is protective. There's lots of evidence that belonging to a religious organization and actively participating in that organization is protective for the development of addiction, with the exception potentially of being an Irish Catholic when it comes to alcohol addiction. So this is sort of interesting data. In general, it's protective, but there are some silos where it's not necessarily protective. And that Irish Catholic thing is probably a combination of cultural mores around drinking, as well as maybe some innate biological inherited vulnerability to alcohol addiction. There are all kinds of sociological protective factors. So, having meaningful work, living as part of a functional family, having a close, sober social network. These are all protective factors. So, kind of the things you would imagine.
And another key point or topic as you discuss recovery in the book is honesty, and going along with honesty, shame. And how do these two things figure into the recovery process?
Well, one of the things I've learned from my patients over many years is that the ones who get into and maintain long-term recovery are the ones who have learned that they can't lie. And it's not just that they can't lie about their addiction and their use. They can't lie about anything. They can't even lie about why they were late for a meeting. They have to be radically honest, which got me really curious. What is that phenomenon? How does that relate to compulsive overconsumption? And I speculate in the book a bunch of different reasons why, including the possibility that intentionally engaging in truth telling might actually bolster the prefrontal cortex, which functions like the brakes on the car. And there's some inferential evidence to suggest that may be the case, as well as the fact that truth telling, I think, socially creates a plenty mindset as opposed to a scarcity mindset. And I use for evidence that the famous marshmallow experiment, where kids were told, if you don't eat this marshmallow for 15 minutes, you'll get a second one. But there was another experiment where half the kids were told, if you ring this bell within those 15 minutes, a researcher will come back. And the other half were told the same thing, but in one of those groups, the researcher actually came back, and the other group, they didn't come back when the kid rang the bell. And in the group where the kids were lied to, they were much more likely to eat the marshmallow before the 15 minutes was up. So this idea that when we can't trust the people around us to do the things that they said they were going to do, it puts us into this kind of scarcity mindset or survival mode, where, of course, we're thinking, I'm going to eat this marshmallow right now because who knows if I'm really going to get the second one when they come back. So, different sort of levels of trying to understand that phenomenon. And then I have a whole section on shame. To me, shame is really interesting. Shame is very pervasive in addiction and can be really a barrier to getting into recovery. The overwhelming shame that people feel about these behaviors, which then perpetuate the addictive behaviors. But I make the point that we wouldn't want to be without shame. Shame is a highly pro-social emotion. If we didn't experience shame about these behaviors, we wouldn't be motivated to change them. So it's figuring out what to do with shame and how to make it positive so that it propels positive behavior change. And I think that really depends on what others do with our shame, right? If we sort of admit to some shameful activity and we're shunned for it, that's likely to contribute to these ongoing maladaptive behaviors. But if we're actually embraced for it, like people are in Alcoholics Anonymous, then we can really leverage shame as a way to promote intimacy and propel behavior change. So I talk a lot about that.
Well, Anna, this has been so fun. You mentioned that you had listened to a few episodes of the podcast beforehand. So a lot of these episodes can be very abstract and technical. So I love the opportunity. I love this opportunity to talk about something practical, important that, can touch everybody's life and certainly has touched mine. So thanks again so much for talking with me.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was my pleasure. I was quite nervous about this interview because and watching the other interviews and thought, oh man, is he going to ask me some really hard philosophical questions and use some of this, free energy principle? I'm like, I have no idea. I might not even understand the question, but thankfully you kept it at my level. So I appreciate it.
Hold on, Geeslings. Before you go, please subscribe, follow if you haven't already. Smash all those buttons. And also, if you haven't followed me on Twitter at Robinson Earhart, or if you're not joining me every morning as I eat my pint of ice cream on Twitch at Robinson Earhart on Robinson Eats, please do so.